Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hey all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods, we will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello, and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I'm one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm your other host, Shelby or Shecup.
Yeah, and we're back with a lore episode. I feel like it's been a hot minute, but I guess it's only really been 2 weeks.
It's been 1 week. Like last week was patron chat, so...
Right, but I guess talking about
Yeah,
the lore.
I guess that's fair.
All right, and we're here for actually something we haven't done in a long time, which is a character deep dive.
Yeah, we haven't done a character deep dive. I'm like looking up to see the last one we did, which I'm pretty sure was Isabella's.
I think you're right.
And that was in October of 2024. So it has been quite a few hot minutes, actually.
So who are we talking about?
So today we are talking about Duncan from Dragon Age Origins and The Calling. So he is a very iconic character. A lot of people really love him. And I know that there is a subset out there of people who also kind of hate him. So we'll get into all of those things throughout this episode. But first, I think it's time for some fun facts.
All right, let's do it.
So Duncan is voiced by one of the most iconic voice actors of our time, Peter Renaday, who voiced other iconic video game characters like Al-Mualim from Assassin's Creed 1 and Revelations, as well as Easy Pete in Fallout New Vegas. And he's voiced characters in movies and TV shows like The Aristocats, Mulan, Aladdin, Gargoyles, The Prince of Egypt, and so many more. He sadly passed away last year in 2024 at the age of 89. Yeah, it's so funny to me that two of the most iconic voice actors in Assassin's Creed and Dragon Age are the same person, and we just happen to have shows about both of those fandoms. So I just find it funny, but I mean, his voice was so iconic, and I think that that's one of the reasons why Duncan is so beloved.
I definitely agree with that.
So I have a couple other fun facts, and the first one is that a male dwarf noble origin can have a son, and you can name this son after Duncan. And technically, though he is confirmed to pass away during the Battle of Ostagar, we never find his body. And then lastly, in the Fade and Origins, Duncan appears as a sword and shield warrior, though he is consistently depicted as a rogue throughout the rest of the game and in The Calling.
That's interesting. In the game, he has a sword and shield warrior, but we're first introduced to him. He's using a dagger, and he has a sword and dagger on the back. But I just think it's really interesting that, yeah, because he doesn't, in The Calling, he is not a He is not a warrior.
He's not a warrior, no. It very much seems to me like an oversight of like, oh, they created this fade scene and then had the calling. It had been written, and probably the Battle of Ostagar, like that DLC where you can get his weapons. Like they had the idea for him to be a rogue, but it just, for whatever reason, whoever animated the fade scene was not clued into that.
Mm-hmm. I wonder also with the never finding his body if there is a moment of something where Duncan was meant to come back at some point, like come back as like a ghoul in Awakening or something like that.
Yeah, I think they probably left their options open just because they didn't know.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, so let's get into his general backstory. So, and the first thing is going to be the most Dragon Age thing you've ever heard. So according to the tool set of Origins, Duncan is the bastard son of an Antivan noble family. But according to the Duncan Codex entry in Origins, his father was from Tevinter and his mother was from the Anderfels. And yet, in the calling, he describes himself as half Ferelden and half Riveni. So if you just count those up, that is every country in Thedas except for the Free Marches and Orlais.
That is true. It reminds me of when we played D&D and we had that character in the party who every time someone would ask where he was from, he would say a different story. And so you're like, what is the truth?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So maybe that's why this is conflicted, right? That maybe Duncan is just making up stories.
That would be a great headcanon. But David Gator has confirmed that the calling version is the correct one. But I did put a little meme in our show notes of Oprah when she's like, so what is the truth? Because this is a lot. Like, this is pretty egregious even for Dragon Age.
I agree.
Okay, so now that we've got his ancestry covered, let's talk about his actual life. So Duncan was born in Highever, which is in Ferelden, but he did spend a lot of his childhood between Orlais and the Free Marches. So one of those last two remaining countries, we'll just mark that off too, since he spent a lot of time there. But his mother was a woman named Tayana, and his father, Aaron, was a carpenter. And his parents died when he was pretty young. And so, he really didn't have any options. He didn't have any other family to turn to. And so he became a thief in order to survive on the streets. And he makes his way eventually to Val Royeaux, where he stays until he becomes a Grey Warden. Now, in Val Royeaux, as one would expect, he experienced and saw and created a lot of death, dysfunction, and violence. One of his first friends, and potentially lovers, was a young pickpocket girl who was struck by a nobleman's carriage. And she basically, after she got hit by this carriage, laid in the street begging for help and bleeding out, and no one came. Nobody came to help her. And so she eventually was able to kind of crawl into a nearby alleyway where she later would die. And so this is kind of like Duncan's, one of his formative moments of like seeing this death up close and seeing, tragedy happen to young people and to people who can't really control it. So I think this is a formative experience for him.
Yeah, it definitely would be. And it very much explains like Duncan's backstory in the calling, or even like how he behaves in the calling, because even in the calling, he and Fiona very much are like, yeah, Merrick doesn't care about anyone that's not noble. Merrick doesn't care about the actual people. Nobles don't care about the actual people because that's their experience.
Exactly. And I mean, I can't necessarily disagree with them either. So let's move on to Duncan as a teenager. So As an adolescent, Duncan was kind of a little slut. He was well known actually, to seek out short-term flings, relationships at like flop houses and brothels, and then he would like never see the women ever again. So that is where Duncan's at when he's a teenager. At this age, is when he also tried to cross the wrong person. He broke into a room at an inn to rob it, but was confronted by an Orlesian warden, who was the person who had rented the room. And this person's name was Guy. And so Duncan was attempting to steal a ring from Guy. And in their scuffle, Duncan kills him. He kills the warden. And so as Guy, the warden, is lying on the floor, dying, he thanks Duncan for killing him. And Duncan at this point is like totally thrown off by it, because as bad as his life had been up to that point, he never had ever thought that death could be something to be grateful for. But, you know, for a warden, especially if you dislike being a warden or didn't want to be a warden, death would be a release. And so this kind of screws Duncan up. Mm-hmm. So he's then arrested by a chevalier, and that's when he finds out that Guy was a Grey Warden. And so he gets sentenced and is basically like, okay, yeah, you're going to get executed. And so right before his execution, Commander Genevieve, who was the fiance, or at least soon to be fiance, to the dead warden, offered him a place in the Grey Wardens. Astoundingly, Duncan is like, no, I think I'd rather die, because he's like, all he can think about is Guy basically thanking him for killing him. And he's like, I don't want to join this order at any cost, which, to be fair, is pretty understandable if that's like your formative experience with this group. And so Genevieve, if you've read The Calling, you can understand that she's furious. And so in response, she conscripts Duncan instead, using the right of conscription. So he does end up joining the order. And, you know, Guy was a really beloved warden. They loved him a lot, and he probably would have risen to commander of the Grey. Like, he was just very well respected among his peers. And so you can imagine the little shit that killed him is not going to be treated very well. And so Duncan is despised by the rest of the wardens, and even the fellow recruits. And so Duncan tried to run away and continued his thieving behavior multiple times in his first few years with the wardens. And all of this happens about 6 months or so before The Calling novel. And it should be noted that in The Calling, like, he is not super dedicated to the wardens. Like, he is not gung-ho reciting the motto. Like, he is not about the wardens. He does not particularly care about them. And you can see his past behavior as a thief coming into his portrayal in that book as well, because he steals from the Circle, which ends up saving all of their lives. So that's important to remember.
Yeah, this whole scene is, you don't find out this scene until like probably 2/3, a half to 2/3 through The Calling is when we get the flashback to this scene. But it does lead to one of the sickest burns in all of Dragon Age, in my opinion, which is when it's confronted that Genevieve has betrayed them and they're fighting, and Duncan taunts her, and he goes, you know, I always thought Guy thanked me for death because he didn't want to be a warden, but actually I think he thanked me for death because it got him out of marrying you.
Woof. Yeah. I mean, that is a pretty sick burn. I mean, and it's harsh, but also, you know, I personally hate Genevieve, so, I mean, I think she deserves it, but that's just my take on it.
But yeah, but it is a formative thing of, like, I think had Duncan and Logain actually gotten to have conversations with each other, they would have found that they we're kindred spirits in a lot of ways.
I very much agree with that. I think they have so much in common. And I think that it's unfortunate that, Logain hates Duncan, A, because he's a warden, B, because probably he lived in Valroyo, and C, because Kaylin idolizes him. And Merrick allows him to stay in Ferelden. So it is unfortunate. I do have to wonder what could Logain have learned from Duncan if he had just been able to see past some of his biases and prejudices.
Right. And I mean, it's so similar of two characters that are in the games depicted as warriors, but in the books are rogues.
True. That's true. And they're dark haired and kind of sassy. And tragedy at a young age. They're very similar characters, and I've truly never really picked up on that before, just because Logain is so villainized in Origins, and then Duncan is idolized. So,
and it makes you think if Duncan and Logain had grown to trust each other, Logain probably would have. I think he did know about Alistair, but there probably would have been a more positive view to Alistair.
Yeah, he definitely knew about Alistair, because that's at the end of the calling. But yeah, for sure. All right, so I have a few more things to tell you about Duncan's backstory, and then we can get into the mid-break. So according to his codex entry in Origins, it says, quote, "Like many others, Duncan gave up his family name when he joined the ranks of the Wardens, a symbolic gesture of cutting ties." So we don't know his family, and we don't know if there are other members of his family running around out there.
That's interesting. And now that's really interesting, that piece of lore coming through in the protagonist, because the protagonist is always referred to as the warden, is never even if they're a Kuzland, is never referred to as Warden Kuzland, but the others like Inquisitor Llewellyn, Inquisitor Trevelyan, Hawk,
that's true. Stuff. I mean, and even Rook, if you're a Rook warden, though, they do have a last name.
They do, yes.
But yeah, I do think it's interesting, and I think there are going to be some notable exceptions. I do think if your hero of Ferelden is a Kuzlan, there's no way, their family is going to be known. Alistair, we know he's a Theron. Everybody in Ferelden's going to know who he is. That kind of stuff. Same for Logain if he becomes a warden. So I think there are some situations for sure that just kind of, you're just going to know. But I do think, if you look at Davrin in the Veilguard, this is one area where okay, they didn't forget the little lore, because he doesn't have a surname either, which is one of my biggest criticisms of that game. But so this is an area for sure where they did not forget. So I have to give them a little bit of applause for that. Okay, so sometime after the calling, Duncan is named second in command of the Ferelden Grey Wardens. You might be wondering how he went from an Orlesian company of wardens to a Ferelden company, which there's not really a company of Grey Wardens at this time in Ferelden. It's really just him and this one other person. But anyway, we'll get into that. So at the end of the calling, he stays in Ferelden, and Merrick basically, charges him to watch over Alistair, because Fiona does not want him raised at court as a royal bastard. She knows that'll be bad for him. So she doesn't want that. And so Duncan stays in Ferelden, and the Grey Wardens are welcomed back into the country after everything that happened a few centuries earlier with Sophia Dryden. And so Duncan works his way up to work under someone named Commander Polara. And he and her are two of the first ones welcomed back into the country. And so he basically just works his way up to be her second in command. And so it's sometime around 910 Dragon when he ascends to the role of Warden Commander himself after Commander Polara mysteriously disappeared. We're not really sure of the context or situation there, but so she disappears, and so he then takes up her mantle of rebuilding the Ferelden Order with frankly varying levels of success, right, and hostility at most turns. And so this is what he's doing when we meet him in Origins.
Yeah, and I think this will come into later discussion on some overarching things about Duncan, but this is his main motivation in Origins. And I think if you can remember that, you can understand some of his actions in game a little bit.
Especially if, and it's a big if, but if Merrick or Loghain told him, hey, a blight's coming, since they know that from Flemeth, then yeah, I mean, I can see how he would be singularly focused on rebuilding the Ferelden Order of Wardens. And even if he doesn't know that, it makes total sense for the Wardens to want to rebuild in Ferelden.
Right. And as we know from every single game that we ever play, the Wardens aren't great at listening to underlings who warn them about things happening.
True, but also, I mean, I wouldn't really necessarily declare the king of Ferelden an underling.
Oh, no, I meant that Duncan would feel alone because the Orlesian Wardens and the first Warden would not take him seriously.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I got you now. That makes more sense, yeah. All right, well, I think it's time to go to our mid-break.
Okay.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
I went to Kirkwall once. Yeah? Bit of a shithole. Yeah.
Well, tell me, have you ever licked a lamppost in winter?
What do you think rooks like in person? Do you think they smell nice?
What is wrong with you? And have you forgotten which side you're on?
No. I mean, think about if we could turn them. Riding beside a rook at the head of Devinter's vast armies. I could stab them for you, on the house.
All right, welcome to the middle of the show where we take time to thank our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Genesis and Lisa M. We have a new patron, Mark M., who signed up, so thank you so much for signing up. And we have a special thank you to our Nug King, Lewis H., who gets thanked at every mid-break of the show. If you'd like to join us on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/DALorecast. You can sign up at various tiers. If you sign up at First Enchanter or higher, you can come on our monthly patron chat. If you can't support us on Patreon, great way to support us is to leave us ratings and reviews on Apple or Spotify. If you leave us a comment or a review with 5 stars and some kind words, we'll read it out on a future episode of the show. And so today I have a comment on our Masked Empire episode. This comes from LSFMX, and so they say a rock solid book review of one of the most impactful DA novels to date. The characters and their politics are discussed perfectly within the exact context of the lore. The Cubs also do not shy away from briefly reminding us that the type of violence depicted in the novel did not always sit well with the fans from certain backgrounds. This is definitely one of my favorite episodes you two have produced. Nice work, Cubs. Thank you so much for that comment. We are so glad that you have joined us on, or that you enjoyed that episode. And then lastly, for the mid-break, you can join us on Discord, the Cubs Podcasting and More Discord. This is where we talk about everything. Come talk about video games, come talk about Dragon Age, Assassin's Creed, whatever you want to talk about. Come and join the Discord and hang out with us there. You can find that link on our website, in the episode description, in every episode description, and probably some other place on the internet that I'm not aware of. But with that, I think we're ready to get back into the episode.
Don't Templars have anything better to do than come up with new ways to torment mages?
No.
Again, I'm so sorry Manfred keeps wandering in while you're asleep, Lucanus.
I think he wonders about spite.
Curiosity has feet. We have enough feet already. It has feet.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
All right, so let's get into Duncan's involvement in the game. So I'm not going to give you a huge overview of The Calling because you can just go listen to our episode on that book. But just to sum it up a little bit, Duncan is a young, impetuous, and bitter man who does not, at any cost, want to be part of this mission. And he doesn't even really want to be part of the Wardens, but he is loyal to Genevieve because she is the one who saved his life. And so he's kind of in this place of mixed feelings, I would say, until we get to the point where Austin mentioned earlier, where he is done with her. But ultimately, he does escape the conflict and the Calling, and he stays in Ferelden afterwards to watch over Fiona and King Merrick's child, who is Alistair. And so that's The Calling.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of my favorite parts of this book in regards to Duncan is Duncan and Fiona's friendship or relationship throughout the book, because there's so much of like mutual respect between the two of them, and like both of them are some of the first to be like, something's wrong with Genevieve, like we need to, like, she's out of control, basically.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is because they are both new to the Wardens, and so they're not kind of like, I think the older ones are a little bit blinded by the like, oh, well, she's just about to go on her calling, like that's why she's acting crazy. And like she is, but also it's being sped up in her artificially by the architect. And so I think that Duncan and Fiona, just because they don't know as much about the Wardens, they see through that a little bit more than the older ones do, or at least they don't make as many excuses for her behavior.
Right. And I think that Duncan and Fiona very much understand each other from the sense of they have had to always just look out for number one. Like, look out for them because life has been unfair to them.
And because nobody else will, because they don't have anyone else.
Right.
And I think there are a couple of them, notably Kel, who is the same way, but the rest of the party, I don't think they have that. So...
Right, and I think this is one of Merrick's shortfalls, and this is like, Merrick does know hardship. Like, he grew up the son of a rebel queen, he watched his mother get murdered in front of him, and all of those things. But at the end of the day, Merrick really doesn't know what it's like to have no one looking out for you except for you.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, also... even though he's had hardship, he still lived a life of privilege because he was always the heir. And so, yeah, even when they were camping, but like he still had the nicest tent. Mm-hmm. He still had the first bowl of stew, you know? So, yes, it was rough, but also he was treated better, even in those conditions.
Exactly.
And Duncan never had that luxury. So, okay, I want to go through each of the origins in Origins. Because he is so pivotal in all of them. So he is also the narrator in Origins and is actually the first voice you hear when you begin the game. And like I said, he does appear in every single Origin since he is the reason your character joins the Wardens. So let's get into it. And I have not organized these in any specific way. They're just the way I did them. So don't take offense if your favorite is last. So, Human Noble. Duncan is visiting the Cousland family, looking for another recruit. The assumed best candidate is a man named Sir Gilmore, but Duncan secretly has his eye on you, the Cousland. When Howe's soldiers attack, Duncan rescues you on the condition that you become a warden. What do you think about this origin?
This origin for me, like, I think this is the origin that is meant to be played in Dragon Age Origins. Like, this is the one that they, like, designed the game for. I feel like, even though there is the rumor of, like, the human commoner that was, like, basically Star Wars copy and pasted. You're a farm person, your farm gets attacked, your caregivers are killed, and you have to go on this adventure.
I still think the human commoner would be fun, but that's just me.
I mean, I do too. But I think Duncan gets a lot of flack for his actions in this origin, specifically in this origin, and the city elf origin is, I think, where Duncan gets the most flack.
I think it's this one personally.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like, and not that he knew what Hal was going to do or anything, but like he could have just let you go. But he needs his recruits, so I get it.
And I do think that, like I said earlier, like he needs his recruits. And I think that it's a point of Duncan does not have the luxury of traveling with someone who is not going to become a Grey Warden.
Mm-hmm, fair. All right, so let's go to Mage. So in Mage, Duncan is visiting the Circle Tower to recruit mages for King Kaelin's army, supposedly. That's his cover. First, Enchanter Irving introduces your player character to him, and then after the whole shebang with Jowan, he who shall not be named, Duncan reveals that he was also searching for Warden recruits. And basically is like, you're coming with me now, and forces Irving to release you into his custody because with your actions with Jowan, you are now either complicit 100% in blood magic or at least a party to it.
Mm-hmm. And I think with this one, and back to the Kuzlin one, with Duncan, again, what are your options? Like, with the Kuzlin, like, he could, yes, let you go, but what, you're just going to go live on the run for your rest of the life? At least with the Wardens, you have a path forward for some kind of vengeance, some kind of
stability. To make something out of your life.
And with the Mage origin, okay, you're going to become tranquil, like
tranquil, or go to the Mage prison.
Yeah, like, or you could become a Warden, which frees you from all of that. Like, it's more of those options than like, yes, the Warden, you could die, but in most cases you're gonna die anyway if you don't choose to go with the Warden.
Right, and I think that that's really important context as we get to the end of the episode, because I'm going to have some discussion questions about this. So let's go to City Elf. Because Duncan in this one, you're right, he's pretty controversial. So he arrives in the alienage hoping to recruit the child of Adaya, who was a renowned warrior and just so happens to be your player character's mom and one of the only black women in Dragon Age. One of a few. So anyway, after your PC is either arrested for killing Von Kendalls or robbing him, Duncan formally invokes the rite of conscription, which just kind of like saves you from the wrath of the humans, because if you're not aware, Von Kendalls is a horrible man and a rapist who either assaults you or your fiance. And so personally, when I play this, I kill the man. And so obviously he's a noble, and the humans, they want your head for that. And so Duncan kind of rescues you from that. But he does use the rite of conscription to do it.
Because that's the way of, like, that's how he's going to get. And, like, rite of conscription sounds harsh because it's like it's forcing you. But really what Duncan is doing is, I'm superseding your authority.
Yeah.
Like, because otherwise they have authority over you to say, no, you're not going to go join the Wardens. You're going to do that. But if Duncan invokes this right, they have
no say.
They have no say.
And I mean, frankly, I don't have an issue with his actions in this one, because the reality is they were going to kill you. Mm-hmm. No matter what. The humans were going to kill you. So he saves your life.
Yeah. And I also think it is important to note that Wardens have a policy, maybe not quite like a vow or an oath, but a policy to not get involved in political or internal conflicts, even though they do all the freaking time.
Well, I mean, if you just look at they have a vow not to get involved in the politics of the nation. And that's especially important in Ferelden, when they were just allowed back after a high-ranking Grey Warden got involved in the politics of the nation, right? So it's important for sure for Duncan to remember this, but also in half of these origins, he's getting involved in nation's politics. Like in the Dwarven ones, he's involving himself in Orzammar politics. To be fair, in the Kuzlin one, he just kind of gets wrapped up in it. And then, obviously in the Elven one, it's like this tension between the humans and the elves. So it's a very, very fine line that they have to walk. Okay, so let's get into the Dalish elf. So after Tamlin and your player character interact with the blighted Alluvion, Duncan rescues you when you fall unconscious. He later explains to you and Meryl that Tamlin is most likely dead by now because that Alluvion was blighted, and guess what? You're gonna die of the blight corruption too, unless... And then you join the Wardens and are healed, quote unquote, by the joining. This is one that it's very, very much like, okay, Duncan did nothing wrong here. Mm-hmm. He just ended up being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah. This just is a little tangent related to this origin. But given the context of the Veil Guard, I am now super curious how this Alluvion got blighted.
I know, me too. Do you have thoughts on this origin?
I do agree with you. I don't think he has done really anything wrong. I mean, it's a point of saying, again, it's a point of you can join me or you can die a horrible death.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So for the Dwarven origin, Dwarven noble Duncan and several Warden friends arrive to celebrate a feast held by King Endrin Iduken in honor of your player character's promotion to an Orzammar commander. So while your character is leading a secret mission to recover the Iduken family shield, dwarves and wardens are attacking the Darkspawn. However, during the expedition, Treon Iduken, your older brother, is killed, and you are framed for it by your other brother, Balin. So Treon, of course, is the heir, and it's very, very dramatic, very, very bad situation. And so you do get exiled because I guess you're found guilty. I don't remember exactly all the options for this one. But you do get exiled, and then Duncan immediately takes you into the Wardens, which, like, can you just imagine the whiplash of like a dwarven princess or a prince who has never been to the surface, who gets exiled from your community, loses everything, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to adjust to life on the surface, like I'm going to figure out my way, and then this guy that you just met who was a friend of your dad's comes along and is like, oh, you can come with me, you can fight the Grey War, or you can join the Grey Wardens and fight the Darkspawn, which you were going to do anyway. And it's like kind of like the whiplash of it all is crazy.
Well, I don't think you haven't actually done this origin. Correct?
This is the only one I haven't done, yes.
Yeah. So what, if you're okay with a little bit of spoiler?
Of course.
What happens is you're framed for this and you're basically exiled in a like going on your calling-esque adventure where they're like, you're exiled into the deep roads knowing full well that you're going to get overrun by Darkspawn, and you come into, I think, the Legion of the Dead and the Grey War and Duncan fighting Darkspawn, and he comes in and he says, let's do this. So even in this, Duncan isn't like circumventing the law. He just is like finding this loophole. It's like, I found this exiled dwarf in...
Yeah, he's capitalizing on the opportunity that has presented itself.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, so let's lastly talk about Dwarven Commoner. So in this one, Duncan arrives in Orzammar to watch a proving competition, and he watches your player character win while being disguised as another fighter, and so you get, like, obviously you get found out, and this is like a huge deal because the provings are, you know, a really big deal in Dwarven culture, and so you get imprisoned for your deception, and so you are able to escape from the prison. And when you do, Duncan intervenes and recruits you before the authorities find you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the reason you're in the provings is the Carta wants to rig the proving.
Yeah. So I do think something that's really notable about all of these is that, you know, there's 6 different origins, but in only one of them is the right of conscription invoked.
That's true.
something to think about.
And it's not even invoked because the player character would be unwilling to join the Wardens.
No.
It's to circumvent the law.
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely play it as if you are unwilling to join, I think, in every single origin. But I don't think that that's really the intent in the game.
No, I don't think so either.
All right, so let's talk about what happens next, which is going to be pretty brief. But after your origin story, you travel to Ostagar with Duncan, where you meet Loghain, King Kaelin, Alistair, and lots of other NPCs. You are preparing for the joining ritual, while the rest of the people gathered are preparing to fight the Darkspawn Horde. And this is what will be the Battle of Ostagar. And unfortunately, Duncan does die in this battle, and that's really the last time we see him, except for one other time, which is in the Fade sequence. And we learn via conversations with Alistair that Duncan was actually already starting to experience his calling, so he really wouldn't have had much longer to live past this battle anyway. He probably would have been able to make it through this blight, but I would imagine after this blight, or even during this blight, he would probably die, or even be the one to slay the archdemon.
Mm-hmm. He definitely would have been the one to take up and slay the archdemon
if he could.
If he had made it. But it's very like when you're going into the Battle of Ostagar and Alistair throws a fit at Duncan because he's like, I don't want to go light a tower. I want to be down in the battle with you. Duncan almost has this kind of like Obi-Wan-esque kind of knowledge where he's like, no, I'm not coming back from this fight. And I need to ensure that you, as the heir of Ferelden, can... There will be a secret heir of Ferelden alive.
Yeah, and I also think, there's absolutely no way, even not knowing with everything that Loghain planned, I'm sure there's just no way that the Wardens... that Duncan would not have had knowledge of the size of the Horde. Like, it was always going to be a tough uphill battle, even with Loghain's extra forces. And so there's no way that, like, he didn't already know exactly what he was facing with their scouts and everything. So he knew exactly how dire it was going to be. He just didn't realize that, hey, we're also going to get betrayed.
And he also knew that Fergus Kuzlin was delayed.
Yeah.
Because Fergus does not make it to the Battle of Ostagar.
Right, true. All right, so that's about everything with his story. Let's get into some quotes and characteristics and discussion. So I really only have 2 quotes from him today. And so the first one is, quote, I sometimes wonder if the Chantry's many laws regarding magic are even necessary. Darkspawn are a greater threat than blood mages, even abominations. It takes decades for the world to recover from a blight. End quote.
I think this quote is really meaningful and very much like characterizes the Grey Warden's entire view of magic. And like the Veilguard kind of just proves like, okay, what's the point of running after Maleficarum if there's this giant monster horde that is going to kill everyone anyway.
Yeah. Fair. So the second quote I have is, be careful what you wish for. Power is treacherous. I have seen many people, great leaders, consumed by it, which again, I think is, he's got the nail on the head.
Mm-hmm. He has become, and like, I think you can get a full appreciation for Duncan even just playing Origins. I think they do a good job of getting that character and like really making you feel sad that he is dead. But like the calling just so amps all of that up. And like to see how he starts of this kid who really is only looking out for himself, doesn't want to be here, to the wise mentor who is willing to risk it all for the greater good.
Absolutely. So that totally transitions into my next little section, which is personality and characteristics. So I have a few. Let me know if you have any to add. So I would say that Duncan is wise, level-headed, diplomatic and charismatic, reserved and loyal.
I definitely agree with that because he does prove even loyalty to Merrick Merrick and Fiona. And I think his protection of Alistair is mainly out of loyalty to Fiona than it is out of loyalty to Merrick.
I agree because they have had a longer relationship than his relationship with Merrick. And like we didn't really get into a lot of his protection of Alistair because that's more of an Alistair deep dive. But it's not really like in Alistair's childhood. Like he looks over him occasionally when he can, but like he's traveling throughout Ferelden. It's really when Alistair joins the Wardens that Duncan is able to take more of an interest in him, and getting Alistair to join the Wardens in and of itself is a way that Duncan looked out for Alistair. So don't hear me say, oh, Duncan was a great man who behaved just like Dumbledore and allowed Alistair to live in abuse. Like, no, like that is not the situation here. So, this just kind of ties into my first discussion question, because the reality is some people love Duncan, some people hate Duncan. Most of the critiques about Duncan, I think, fall in one of two camps. They're either about the fact that he left Alistair in an abusive situation, or that he's unnecessarily cruel in recruiting, example, forcing the Kuzland to join or die. What are your thoughts about this?
I can see how someone can arrive. I'm going to do the Alistair one first. How can arrive at that situation with Alistair, but at the same time, like with Dumbledore, it's hard to see how this is the safest place for Harry. Like the Dursleys are the safest place because there's so many people that could take him in, and you're telling me that the Potters only had the grandparents and James Potter, like there are not any other relatives of their family that could keep this protection going or something like that. And so there's that with Dumbledore, and that's not really the case with Alistair. Like Redcliffe is truly the safest place for Alistair.
Yeah.
At the moment, given Isolde. That's her name.
Yeah.
Given her treatment of him. But like, yes, Isolde was terrible to Alistair in that, but he has very fond memories of Arl Eamon.
Yes, he does.
And like he doesn't behave like a child who felt like he was unloved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really telling of what kind of home. I think people overplay the feeling that Alistair would have regardless of the home situation that he would be in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I also think that like we forget sometimes that Alistair is a royal bastard. Like you can't just place him in a foster home or an orphanage. Like wherever you put him, like any of the bands or Arls in Ferelden, like a lot of them are going to be anti and would potentially kill him. And then a lot of them are going to just try to like corrupt him against the Therans and the Garans so that they can control him. So there's really no good place to put him. And so that's why A, he ends up with the Garans in Redcliffe, and then B, that's why he later does end up with the Chantry. And I agree, those are two of the safest places for him, and I think Duncan does his best, but Duncan also has a full-time job that requires him to travel. Like this is not a Dumbledore situation where he gets to live in a big fancy castle and administers a school all day every day and has a bunch of free time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it comes down to the fact that Alistair is loved in this situation is a testament, because Alistair is proof that Merrick cheated on Eamon's sister.
True. Very true. Although I think she was dead at that point.
She was dead, you're right.
But like fairly recently dead. So like it would still be a knife wound, in my opinion.
Right. But like Eamon puts that aside. And I think Eamon has his own power hungry, his own agenda, and he is not a perfect person. But I don't think that it is akin to Dumbledore leaving Harry in a family that literally deprived him of food.
Right. And I agree with you. And I think that Eamon is a good man who is in a really tough situation and is trying badly, trying and failing to keep everyone happy. And when you try to do 3 jobs that are at odds with each other, you're going to do those 3 jobs half-assed. And that's kind of the situation, I think, rather than full-on abuse.
And I think because Eamon does send him to the Templars, or does he go willingly?
He goes to the Chantry. He sends him to the Chantry, and then he studies and like tries to join the Templars. Right. And anyway, I don't want to get too more into the Alistair tangent, but I do have another discussion question before we talk about why we love or hate Duncan, which is just, do you think that the Duncan portrayed in The Calling and the Duncan portrayed in Origins, do they fit together as the same character, or do they almost feel like 2 separate characters?
I think they do feel as 2 separate characters when you're reading them, but for me they should, because there's like 2 or 3 decades between The Calling Duncan and Origins Duncan.
Yeah, it's like 22 years, I think, because Alistair is like 20 in Origins. Mm-hmm. And I mean, The Calling takes place over like, I don't know, several months. And then there's the pregnancy. So I do think that they fit together, but I do think that they are also pretty different. But I think you have to remember that Duncan is new to the Wardens, and he's bitter and pissed off that he was forced to join this order when he didn't want to. And so I think that is going to make anybody act a little bit out of character and act a little bit more like an asshole than they normally would. And so I think it's unfortunate that we don't see more of what has happened in between The Calling and Origins, because it would be really fun to see Duncan grow into the person that he is. Because I do think you can see some of the roots of who Duncan is in Origins when you read The Calling, like his loyalty to Fiona and Merrick, his strategy in battle, like that, those echoes of wisdom. I think you see that for sure in the novel.
Right. And I think that while the events of The Calling are serious, they are not really an extinction level event. The Blight, even though we joke that the 5th Blight is like barely a blight, it is still an extinction level event.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, my last question is, why do you love or hate this character?
I love Duncan just because, I mean, it's a fondness. He's our first introduction to Dragon Age. When I think of Dragon Age Origins, one of the first things is his voice reading The Chantry teaches us that the Blight came to be. And just, he's very iconic, and it's a very moment of like, this man laid down everything and like, he dies unnecessarily. And it's tragic. And I love Duncan because I just think that he is, especially in The Calling, is such a voice of reason. And like, yeah, he's a little shit who goes and steals a dagger from the Circle and could potentially get them in trouble, but that ends up saving them. And like, but he is still like this voice of reason, and like, is not blinded by dogma, basically, which is where Genevieve and her brother are blinded by dogma.
100%. That's a really excellent point. And I do also love Duncan, and I have to be honest with you, if you say Dragon Age narrator to me, I'm so sorry. I don't think of Varric. I think of Duncan, and I love Varric, don't get me wrong, but Duncan, there's just something about the voice that makes it so intriguing. And then you get to meet the voice. And like, of course you do with Varric as well. And like, we all love our chesty dwarf. But I don't know, there's just something about the nostalgia of like thinking back on the first time I ever played this game, the first time I ever played Dragon Age, the first thing I saw and heard was Duncan.
Mm-hmm. And it comes back because when I first played Dragon Age Origins, it reminded me, ironically, so much of Oblivion, because the intro to Oblivion is Patrick Stewart as Uriel Septon saying, "Shut and close the jaws of Oblivion. Find the air and shut and close the jaws of Oblivion." And it's such an iconic thing that I associate with that game and that entry into the Elder Scrolls, that like Dragon Age Origins, like Duncan narrating how the Blight came to be and narrating like how the Wardens came to be is so integral to my understanding of Dragon Age. That I agree with you. When I think of a narrator, I think of Duncan.
Yeah. Also, I just want to say, I should have put this in my fun facts, but he also voiced Abraham Lincoln in the Hall of Presidents at Disney. Which we literally just did a month ago.
I didn't know that.
I didn't notice it at all. All right. Well, I think we are ready to wrap it up for today.
All right. Well, thank you for bringing this research. As always, it was a great episode. A special thank you to our Nug King patron, Lewis H., who gets thanked at the end of every show. And thank you for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DALorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Have you ever wanted to deep dive into the lore and stories behind all your favorite Marvel movies? Then do we have the show for you? I'm Captain Shenko.
And I'm Psych88. Join us as we dissect the media megalith that is the MCU. We'll talk about the origin stories, the fights, and everything in between.
The MCU Lorecast releases on all major podcasting platforms on Mondays as part of the Robots Radio Rocket Club and can be found on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.